is to sit in a space like this and learn from a group of scholars like these. This is just the sort of work that our field aspires to, and it's an honor for me to be associated with it. So thank you, and thanks Pat, and thanks everyone for welcoming me. As for responses to this group of talks and to the general theme of marketing the North, as I was enjoying these presentations with all of you, I was also thinking to myself about ways one might attempt a sort of summary. And while no frame will capture everything, there does seem to be at least one thing that would tend to achieve a sort of thematic unification. And I know I'm not alone in thinking about this. People have sort of mentioned it peripherally. There is this one thing that looms behind all of this, and that's the fundamental structural idea of networks. And I'm not just referring here to networking as in I got to go talk to that guy for a minute. You know. I'm talking about something loosely related to what is known as actor network theory, which we in the ed biz refer to as ANT. And which holds essentially that everything in the social and natural worlds exists in networks of relationships that are constantly shifting, but are always there. In reference to the scholarship that has been presented here, there are a few particular points that are interesting to consider. To begin with, nothing exists outside these networks. None of the varied actors, interests, and institutions in the social sphere is an island in the poetic sense. And networks in a scientific sense are level. That is, everything has a function and a purpose within the structure of the network. And it just occurred to me that Jorn's idea of the mutual goal being more important than the individual contributors to it is interesting in that connection. And then that goal is determined by the network itself. It is the reason for the network's existence. So the locus of control as far as defining ends is concerned is internal. A handy example, as cultural historian Gerald Siegel has explained, is capitalism. Investors import raw materials from a distant elsewhere, feed them into a local manufacturing system, which then turns them out as products to be exported along the same and or other lines of trade to generate funds for the acquisition of more raw materials, etc. Right? Fine. That leaves us then with the question of how this may be relevant for the history of visual culture. There's art, architecture, design, and so forth. To begin with, the basic theme of this conference, the marketing of a region, is a theme inevitably animated and made material by the machinations of networks. And we've seen that at several levels. For instance, Munch's singular mastery as a fashioner and exporter of carefully crafted identities, which several of our speakers remarked on and developed. And in fact, after hearing Drs. Jensen and Voll, one understands the temptation of analyzing Munch as architect of a self-determined network, although that would sort of tend to turn the whole thing on its head. This might also be a place where the lovely nuance of paratext, as mentioned by Lars Toft Eriksson, might actually have a sort of structural role. There are also more specific examples, such as the economic and intellectual networks of which Munch availed himself to arrive at an acceptably Norwegian style of set decoration, which we just talked about. You'll recall the images of set decorations around ghosts, for instance. What's interesting about that example is that interior decoration, particularly the ideological kind, may also be useful as an example of the bidirectionality of networks that was alluded to in the example of capitalism, and also as an example of their fluidity. For instance, art historian Shona Kallestrup has shown that at the very same time Munch was creating stage sets in the pure Norwegian style for a theater production in Germany, Crown Princess Marie of Romania was commissioning and importing a lavishly carved Norwegian boudoir for the Cotroceni Palace in Bucharest. And in both cases, one of the stated goals was authenticity. I was also quite intrigued by Professor Lean's remarks on photography, not only as a form of expression, but also as an emerging career path for women at this time. What immediately came to mind was a Danish photographer that I work on occasion, and that's this woman, Emma Amalie Clausen, who had also trained as a painter, but really found her vocation as an art and tourism photographer around Skagen, the beach community, and eventually became a published poet and a leading authority in Copenhagen on theosophy, of all things. The other aspect of Professor Lean's study that is clearly overdue is the aspect of gender and politics in the creative community at this time. And the quote from Marie Høeg put me in mind of another Dane, Agnes Slott-Müller, who grappled with gender in speeches and writings that have yet to receive adequate attention, and that includes from me, incidentally. I think few presentations could emphasize the multivalent complexities of professional networks more clearly than Dr. Stevens' extraordinarily close logistical study of the 1924 London exhibition. Which is also interesting, obviously marketing-wise, in terms of how such a network could be deployed to the purposes of cultural diplomacy. And Dr. Jensen's analysis of transformations in the art market around what he calls the generation of 1900 certainly seems relevant to a network-oriented analysis, particularly the fascinating development he traces of an expectation of self-governance associated with the emergence of secessionist exhibition practices. And for that matter, the leveling of professional practices that he notes in Bourdieu is also interesting in this connection. Another indication of the utility of ANT comes from a colleague of ours in Denmark, Rasmus Kjærbo, who is a curator at the Ribe Art Museum and who recently completed his doctoral dissertation in which he used ANT as a lens through which to examine the development of and institutions involved with modern art collecting in Copenhagen in the early 20th century. And one of the residual observations in his work was that the emerging definition of modernism in art, and that is the definition according to which modernism was collected. And I would guess one would find similar evidence for architecture and design in the North, depended significantly on how the International Institution of Art and Cultural Criticism functioned within the international network of art dealing. That is, not as an outside force launching editorial salvos, but as a collaborating link within the network of artist buyers, exhibition venues, etc. This we saw all over the place here. Right? We saw it in Emma Lam's careful administration of her husband's persona and affairs, and in the way that Zorn positioned himself as a friend of, for instance, Vittorio Pica, among others. We recall Dr. Jensen's statistics regarding the preponderance of Munch literature and Dr. Lahelma's analysis of the reception of Munch versus Gallen-Kallela. One particular example I'd like to hone in on for a moment is the one that we just saw. And that is Dr. Clark's discussion of Meier-Graefe versus Stenersen. One could look at Meier-Graefe's regionalist projections as eventually influencing the marginalization of the North based on its distance from Paris. But Dr. Clark's observations regarding the tendency of both of these writers to think of the artist as a place, or in terms of a place, allow for another possibility. As Dr. Clark remarks, quote, Munch becomes a stand-in for Norway. He is part of it and yet somehow floats above it. Stenersen's equation of, you remember the history painting from the Aula series, Stenersen's equation of that Nordic terrain with the artist, and thus with Norwegians in general, and Meier-Graefe's valorization of the otherness of Munch's images, and thus of him, do something interesting. At one and the same time, they fix Munch's identity and do so in a way that allows for transcendence. And if I may say so, allows for exportation. Right? I don't mean to impute anything to Meier-Graefe or Stenersen, or to Jay for that matter, in what I'm about to discuss, but Jay's conclusions are suggestive to me here. there's something elegant in the way the institution of art writing contributed to the machinery within those networks that resulted in Munch attaining preeminent status among modernists, right? Among Northern modernists, but among modernists in general. Somehow Munch's regional origin remained part of his identity, but in a way that did not make him too esoteric for acceptance elsewhere in the world. Which is where, I mean, this was a contrast that Maria talked about in terms of Munch versus Galen. There are other artists who achieved this to varying degrees. We have heard about Zorn, who managed to fashion for himself a rugged Swedishness that was right up the alley of certain American admirers, right? I've written a bit about Kreuer, whose blue paintings managed to be at once familiar and exotic in both Paris and Copenhagen. What I'm thinking about right now, however, is on a slightly larger scale. One of the things that has stood as a challenge to scholars of Scandinavian art is precisely the lingering influence of regional identity. Of an assumed, if not actually stated otherness based on, just as Mayer-Greffe predicted, on Scandinavia's relative distance from Paris. And incidentally, this is not a peculiar Parisian prejudice. Centers have lorded it over peripheries since there were any such things. One of the big socio-political narratives of 19th century Denmark was Copenhagen's discovery of the fact that Jutland was not just a Siberian backwater where people ate rocks and threw trees around, you know? And there are other regions, other than Scandinavia, that have had it much worse. Consider the unthinkable 20th century history of the Baltic states. And consider the artistic achievement in those places that are still largely unknown, right? Now, thankfully, we have an uncommonly gifted colleague named Bart Pushaw who will put that situation to rights. But the basic problem of center versus periphery remains persuasive. What I wonder, and this is just a test, you know? What I wonder is how actor network theory might be applied to free us from the obligation to do something about regional identity and regional distality. This is not original to me, but it did repeatedly occur to me here. Recall that ANT is a basically scientific model, and as such, it tends to expose ideological forces as purely abstract phenomena that do not actually exist in the physical world. It is a model for determining what a network does and how actors and institutions contribute to that doing. That is how its means produce its ends. So once the network has been described, it can then be explained in terms of how it interacts with ideological residue. And this might be where we can sort of clear the way to the sort of clear seeing that Dr. Ball was urging us to do. I think also there is an application here to the at once diachronic and synchronic installation of the Munch show that, at SF MoMA that Dr. Haskell was talking about. I don't know if it would work, but it might be worth a try to look at the network first and then attend to regional characteristics later. Now, speaking of networks, we have a little more to do here, but after that, if we line up in that direction, there are drinks on the other side.